Welcome everybody. My guest here, of course, is Roddy Doyle. He's a novelist, a short story writer. He's written screenplays. He's written for TV. Poetry?
No.
No poetry.
Never.
I'm sure everyone in this room would have read his Booker-winning award book, Paddy, Clarke, Ha Ha Ha. But you may not be so familiar with one of his most recent books, a collection of short stories called Bullfighting. And with great pleasure, I'm going to ask Roddy to read a story from that book.
Nice thing about short stories is that you don't have to explain them before you start reading. All the stories are about middle-aged men. I don't know why. This one is called Animals. He remembers carrying the water tank into the house, trying to make sure he didn't trip over a step or a child. The boys were tiny, and the girls, the twins, must have been so small he can't even imagine them anymore. He can't remember filling the tank or dumping the fish into the water, but he sat cross-legged in front of it while the boys gave each fish a name, and the eldest, Ben, wrote them in a list with a fat red marker. There were 7 fish, 7 names. Goldie, Speckly, Big Eyes, and 4 others. They taped the list to the side of the tank, and by the end of the day there were black lines through 3 of the names and 4 fish still alive in the tank. The tank stayed in the room. In fact, George left it there when they moved house 2 years later, long after the last of the fish had been buried. The animals always had decent, elaborate burials. Christian, Hindu, humanist, whatever bits of knowledge and shite the kids brought home from school went into the funerals. George changed mobile phones, not because he really wanted to, but because he knew the boxes would come in handy. It was always wise to have a coffin ready for the next dead bird or fish. He came home one Saturday morning. He'd been away in England. The house was empty. Sandra, his wife, had taken the kids to visit her mother in Wexford. George put his bag down, went across to the kettle and saw the brand new cage and the canary. And the note, red marker again, feed it. And he would have, happily, if the canary hadn't been dead. He had a shower, phoned for a taxi, waited an hour for it to arrive, and told the driver to bring him to Whacker's pet shop in Donaghmede. "Are you serious?" said the driver. "Yeah," said George. What's in Whacker's that's so special?" George waited till the driver had started the taxi. "Pets," he said. He was pleased with his answer. "All right," said the driver. He went through the gears like he was pulling the heads off orphans. Whacker, or whoever he was, had no canaries. Neither did the guy beside Woody's or the shop on Parnell Street. When the kids got home the next day, they found that the canary had turned into 2 finches. George explained it to them. Although they weren't that curious, 2 of anything was better than 1. "A fella on the plane told me that finches were much better than canaries, so I swapped the canary for these lads here, a boy and a girl." "Cool." He'd no idea at the time if it was true, the male and the female, but it must have been because they made themselves a nest and an egg was laid, but nothing hatched. Sandra bought a book and a bigger cage and better nesting material, and the 2 finches became 3, then 5, then back to 4, 3, and 2. More funerals, more dead bodies in the garden. They got an even bigger cage, a huge thing on wheels. The finches, Pete and Amy, he knows the names as solidly as his kids' names, built a nest in the top corner, a beehive of a thing. Amy stayed in there while Pete came out, hung on the bars of the cage and looked intelligent. George went to his mother's house one day to change a few light bulbs and put some old crap up into the attic for her. He made a morning of it, smuggled the book he was reading out of the house, bought a takeaway coffee, drove to the seafront and stayed there for an hour after he'd finished at his mother's, parked facing Europe, reading until he got to the end of a chapter. The Mambo Kings play songs of love and needed to go for a piss. He drove home and walked into the end of the world. Sandra had decided that the morning needed a project, so herself and the kids had wheeled the cage outside and started to go at it with soapy brushes and cloths. A child opened the hatch, Pete flew out, and George found 4 hysterical children in the kitchen, long past tears and snot, and a woman outside in the back garden talking to the hedge. "I can hear him," she said. "Where?" "In there." She was pointing into the hedge, which stretched from the house to the end wall. It was a long garden, a grand hedge. "I can hear him." George could hear the kids in the house. He could hear lawnmowers and a couple of dogs and the gobshite 3 doors up who thought he was Barry White. He couldn't hear Pete, but he definitely heard it, the big whoop of a great idea going off in his head. "Listen," he said, "I'm going to bring the kids to Whackers to see if Pete flew back there. Are you with me?" Sandra looked at him, and he knew she was falling in love with him all over again. Or maybe for the first time, he didn't care. There was a woman in her dressing gown looking attractively distraught, and she was staring at George like he was your man from ER. "While I'm doing that," said George, "you phone Whackers and tell him the story. You with me?" "Brilliant. It might work. It's genius." "Ah, well." It did work, and it was George's greatest achievement. The happiness he delivered, the legend he planted, his proudest moment. All of the gang in Whackers were waiting, pretending to be busy. George carried the girls up to the counter. The boys held on to him. "Dylan here's Finch flew away," said George, and he was thinking that maybe he flew back here. The lad behind the counter looked up from the pile of receipts he was wrapping with an elastic band. "Zebra Finch?" Dylan nodded. "He flew in 20 minutes ago." "Flaked he was," said an older man who was piling little bales of straw and hay. "Knackered. Come over here and pick him out, Dylan." There were 30 finches charging around a cage the size of a bedroom. Dylan was pointing before he got to the cage. "Him? Him? Yeah." The older man opened the small door and put his hand in. He was holding a net and had the finch out and in his fist with a speed and grace that seemed rehearsed and brilliant. "This him?" "Yeah." "What's his name again?" "Pete." The new Pete wasn't a patch on the old Pete. He was a bit drugged looking. George liked the finches, but they were a pain in the neck. The shit, the sandpaper, food, water. He was halfway to Galway one day when they had to turn back because they'd forgotten about the birds and who was going to look after them. They couldn't come home. They were going for 2 weeks to a stinking kitchen in a cage full of tiny, perfect skeletons. They found a neighbour willing to do the job and started off again, a day late. Sandra told George to stop gnashing his teeth. He hadn't been aware he'd been doing it. The fucking birds. But then, another time, he was up earlier than usual. This was back home. He went into the kitchen and saw Dylan sitting in the dawn light, watching the cage, watching Pete and Amy. George stood there and watched Dylan, another of those great moments. This is why I live. George is walking the new dog, a Cavalier Spaniel, a rescue dog. He looks down at it trotting beside him and wonders again what rescue means. The dog is perfect, but it had to be rescued from its previous owners. He's walking the dog because he likes walking the dog and he has nothing else to do. His kids are reared and he's unemployed. He's getting used to that, to both those facts. The election posters are on every pole, buckled by rain and heat. It's early June and the weather's great. The guinea pigs stayed a day and a half and introduced the house to asthma. George came home from work. He remembers that feeling, and the boys showed him the trousers trick. "Look," they said, then brought him over to the new cage, another new cage. There were 2 guinea pigs inside, in under shredded pages of the Evening Herald. Ben, the eldest, opened the cage and grabbed one of the guinea pigs, and George's objections, unsaid, unexplored, immediately broke up and became nothing. The confidence, the sureness of the movement, the hand, the arm into the cage. The kid was going to be a surgeon. He held the guinea pig in both hands. "What's his name?" "Guinea pig," said Ben. He got down on the kitchen floor. Dylan had grabbed the other pig and was down beside his brother. "Look." They sat, legs out and apart. It was summer and they were wearing shorts, and that was where the guinea pigs were sent. Up one leg of each pair. George watched the guinea pigs struggling up the boys' legs, heard the boys' laughter and screams as they tried to keep their legs straight. Dylan sat up and pulled a leg down to make room for the guinea pig to bridge the divide and travel down the other leg. It was a joy to watch, and Ben actually became a barman. But that night he started coughing and wheezing and scratching his legs till they bled. His eyes went red and much too big for his face. They suddenly had a child with allergies and asthma, and the guinea pigs were gone, replaced by the rabbits. The first dog ate one of the rabbits. George wasn't sure anymore if it had been one of the first original rabbits. He could go now, he could turn and walk to Ben's place of work, the next pub after George's local, a 15-minute walk, and ask him. It's early afternoon and the place will be quiet. He can leave the dog tied to the bike rack outside, have a quick pint or just a coffee. The coffee in a pub with a bike rack is bound to be drinkable. He could do that, he has the time, but he doesn't want to seem desperate because that's how he feels. The lost decade. That was what the American economist called it, Paul Krugman, the fellow who'd won the Nobel Prize, on the telly a few weeks before. He hadn't been talking about the last decade, it was the next one. It already had a name, and George knew he was fucked. The quick decision to get rid of the guinea pigs, George hadn't a clue now what had happened to them. Something else he could check with Ben had brought biblical grief down on the house. Ben had actually torn his T-shirt off his own back. It's my fault, it's my fault. Ah, it's not, it is. They filled the car and headed straight to Whackers. Did George ever go to work back then? His memory is clogged with cars, years full of happy and unhappy children, shouting at traffic lights, trying to distract the kids, getting them to sing along to the Pretenders' greatest hits, the Eurythmics' greatest hits, the Pogues' greatest hits. Sandra held Ben's hand and walked him around the pet shop, looking at his eyes. She kept him well away from the guinea pigs. She bent his head over a bucket of rabbits. Breathe. Mammy, I am breathing, I have to. Let's see you. George watched Sandra examining Ben's face, eyes. He was keeping the others outside at the door so they couldn't gang up on Ben if he failed the test and they had to go home empty-handed. But he could tell Ben was grand. They'd be bringing home a rabbit. They brought home 3 and the dog ate one of them. He didn't eat the rabbit exactly. He perforated the spleen and left it on the back step. The rabbit looked perfect and even more dead because of that. Suffer, your man Krugman said, when he was asked how Ireland should deal with the next 10 years. Well, this is George, suffering. Those years when the mortgage was new and money was scarce, when the country seemed to be taking off, waking up or something, when the future was a long, simple thing, a beach, when he could hold Sandra and tell her they'd be fine, she'd be fine. The first miscarriage, her father's death, his own scare. He'd never doubted that they'd be grand. He stands outside the pub, away from the windows. He doesn't want Ben looking out and seeing him there. He isn't even sure if Ben is on today or on the early shift. Gone, that's certainty. It wasn't arrogance. Maybe it was. He doesn't know. It doesn't feel like a sin or a crime. He exploited no one. He invested in nothing. He has 1 mortgage, 1 credit card. 1 mortgage, no job. 7 years left on the mortgage and no prospect of a fucking job. He'll be near retirement age by the time he gets through the lost decade. He'll have nothing to retire from, and the dog he's tying to the bite rack will be dead, and there won't be another dog. This one here is the last animal. The girls found the rabbit on the back step, and they went hysterical. Everyone went hysterical. No one blamed the dog. It was his instinct, his nature. So George couldn't get rid of him. But then he bit Ben's best friend, and fucked nature. He was gone, out down to the vet, put out of George's misery. It's for the best. Goofy was the dog's name. Simon was the friend's. Simon was fine, but the dog was a bastard. Refused to be trained. Stared back at George as it cocked its leg against the fridge and pissed on it. A bastard. And George hid it. The fact that their dog was a bad-minded fucker. The fact that maybe his family had created this monster. He got up before the rest of them every morning and mopped the shit and piss off the kitchen floor before they woke. Had the place clean and smelling of pine when they came in for their Cocoa Pops and Alpen. When Goofy took a chunk out of Simon, when George heard about it, when Sandra phoned him at work, as he ran out to the car, and he actually felt so relieved that guilt never got a look in. 2 stitches for Simon, death to Goofy. A good bottle of Rioja for Simon's parents. He didn't have to bury Goofy or the unfortunate twit that came after him, Simba. George reversed over Simba, heard the yelp, felt the bump, jumped out of the car, and again felt relief when he saw that it wasn't a child that had gone under the wheel. He looked around. He was on his own. He grabbed Simba's collar and hauled him to the front gate. He looked onto the road, thanked God he lived in a cul-de-sac, and dragged Simba out onto the road. Then he went in and told them the bad news. Some bollocks had run over Simba, and felt proud of himself as he wiped tears and promised ice cream and prawn crackers. He never told anyone what had actually happened, and had never felt a bit of guilt about the cover-up. although the owl one across the road looked at him like he was a war criminal. And he wondered if she'd been looking out the window as he dragged Exhibit A down the drive. But he didn't care that much, and anyway, she was dead now too. There's a gang of Poles renting that house now, or there was. It's been quiet over there for a while, and he wonders if they've left, move on. There are stories of cars abandoned in the airport car park. The place is supposed to be stuffed with them. He pats the dog. She's a tiny little thing, smaller still on a windy day when her fur is beaten back against her. 20 minutes, he says. He's actually talking to the dog, out on the street. He's losing it. He straightens up. He looks down at the dog. He can't leave it here. It'll be stolen. The leash will loosen. She'll run out onto the street. He can't do it. He pushes open the pub door. He was right. It's quiet. It's empty. There's no one behind the bar. He waits. He doesn't step in. He wants to keep an eye on the dog. Then there's a white shirt in the gloom, and he can make out a face. It's Ben, his son. Da! Ben, are you all right? I'm grand. I've the dog outside. Bring her in. I don't want to get you in trouble. He shouldn't have said that. It sounds wrong, like he's trivializing Ben, his job. It's cool, said Ben. I can say it's your guide dog. He's come out from behind the bar. He's 22, but he's still the lanky lad he suddenly became 6 years ago. I'll get her, he says. He passes George and comes back quickly, holding the dog like a baby. She had a crap earlier, George tells him. That's good, said Ben. So did I. He puts the dog down, ties the leash to one of the tall stool legs. You sit there, he says, so she can't pull it down on herself. Grand. George sits, then he stands, takes off his jacket. It's too hot for a jacket, he shouldn't have brought it. He sits again. Quiet, he says. Yeah. Is that the recession? Not really, says Ben. It's always quiet this time. What'll you have? What's the coffee like? Don't do it. No coffee. No, nothing that needs a kettle. I'll chance a pint. He watches Ben putting the glass under the tap, holding the glass at the right angle. He's never seen him at work before and knows that he'd be just as relaxed if the place was packed. The air full of shouts for drink. Everything okay, Da? Grand, yeah, not a bother. How's Ma? Grand, says George. Great. Remember the rabbits? The rabbits? The hutch. Goofy killed one of them. Remember? Yeah. He puts the glass back under the tap. He tops up the pint. He pushes a beer mat in front of George. He puts the pint on top of it. Lovely. George takes a tenner from his pocket, hands it out to Ben. There you go. Ben takes it. He turns to the till, opens it, takes out George's change. He puts it beside George's pint. Thanks, says George. There were 3 rabbits, am I right? Yeah, said Ben. Not for long, but... What were they called? Lisa, Breezy and Donut. And Goofy ate Breezy. Lisa, said Ben. Why? Nothing really, says George. Nothing important. It just came into my head. The pint's ready. He hasn't had a pint for a good while. He tastes it. Grand. Good pint, thanks. Do you like the work? It's all right, said Ben. Yeah, I like it. Good, says George. That's good. He hears the door open behind him. He looks down at the dog. She stays still. Good dog. Ben goes to the bar to meet whoever's just come in. George loves the dog. Absolutely loves it. She's a Cavalier, a King Charles Spaniel, white and brown. George loves picking her up, putting her on his shoulder. He knows what he's at, making her one of the kids. But she's only a dog and she's doomed. George watched a documentary on Sky, Bred to Die, about pedigree dogs. And there was one of his, a Cavalier, sitting on the lap of a good-looking woman in a white coat, a vet or a scientist. And she starts explaining that the dog's brain is too big. It's like a size 10 foot shoved into a 6 foot shoe. Sorry, a size 6 shoe. I better say that again. It's like a size 10 foot shoved into a size 6 shoe. The breeders have been playing God, mating fathers and mothers to their sons and daughters, siblings to siblings, just so they look good, consistent in the shows. Pugs' eyes fall out of their heads. Bulldogs can no longer mate. Pekingese have lungs that couldn't keep a fly in the air. And his dog has a brain that's being shoved out of her head, down to her spine. He leans down, picks up the dog. He can do it one-handed. She's close to weightless. Ben is back at the taps, pulling a pint of Heineken for the chap at the other end of the bar. The dog on George's lap is a time bomb. She's going to start squealing, whimpering someday, and that'll be that. He won't get another one. Remember Simba? Ben looks up from the glass. I do, yeah. Why? I hit him, says George. You never hit the dogs, Da. Ben looks worried. No, says George, with the car. With the car. I reversed over him. Why? Not on purpose, says George. I was just parking. Fair play to Ben. He fills the glass, brings it down to the punter, takes the money, does the lot without rushing or staring at George. He's back. Why didn't you tell us? Well, says George, I don't really know. Once I saw it wasn't one of you I'd hit, I didn't give much of a shite. And the chance was there to drag him out to the road, and once I'd done that, I couldn't drag him back, you know? Why now? Why tell you? Yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about it. I don't know. Doesn't matter. I know, says George, but it would have then, when you were all small. No, says Ben. It would have been all right. Do you reckon? Ben looks down at the par. Yes, listen, he said. We all knew we had a great day. George can't say anything. His heart is too big for him, like the dog's brain. The blood's rushing up to his eyes and his mouth. Him and the dog, they'll both explode together. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Over this collection of stories, it's like you drill into the psyche of the disaffected, disillusioned, middle-aged male. Most of the characters hover around about the age of 48. What is it about that age that fascinated you so much, and how much of this book is autobiographical?
Well, I don't remember what it was like to be 48. It seems like, you know, a kid. I think what happens really is that there's little sparks of autobiography that give me the shove towards writing a story, but very quickly it becomes irrelevant. So there are bits and pieces of that story that I just read that actually occurred. So the finch flying back to the pet shop occurred. I gave the idea of it flying back to the pet shop to the father, George, but it was actually, in reality, my son who decided that the bird had flown back to the pet shop. And I drove him and his brother and sister, or his sister hadn't been born then, but him and his brother, to the pet shop, and meanwhile my wife phoned them up and they were waiting. And it was brilliant. It was great. It was just, you know, everything else that goes wrong in, you know, any family life, little things like that, just make it irrelevant, really. It was just a fantastic experience. So, but I can't remember exactly what the spark was. We got 2 Cavalier Spaniels, rescue dogs, and I was just looking at them one day, and they are perfect. One of them, sadly, is dying now, but they were perfect. And I was just wondering, you know, what does rescue mean? You know, so I started writing the story, and then it coincided. I like reading Paul Krugman, The Economist. You know, I think he's very, very good, and he's very clear. He's one of those rare things, an economist that can write in English, and he referred to the lost decade, and it's very chilling, because it would make, you know, I don't know when it started exactly, but it started about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe, when he said 4 years ago. So if you're my age as I was then, I was 50 then, and you add 10 days, you're 60. That's the lost decade. And so these little bits and pieces came together, but very, very quickly, you know, I could go through every story and tell you what sparked it off, but very quickly those little autobiographical things become just, in a way, gossip. You know, something I can say now, but not relevant to the story. The story is all about words, really, you know. And I think what happens is that one of the great things about being a writer is that everything is research, really. I suppose it's a bit invasive if you happen to be married to a writer. Or, you know, but a friend of mine died, and there was I was in the church, and his wife put a big photograph of him in his prime on the coffin. And people around me started laughing. It was and she was smiling, she was grinning, because he had died of cancer, a very awful asbestosis. And he'd shriveled into nothing, you know, and had been a Gaelic football player and a big man, you know, and a builder, built his own house. And, you know, it was such a glorious thing to see the photograph on the coffin, and to see the way she put it on the coffin, because it was, you know, we watched him die. I mean, she was married to the man for 2 years, and I just thought it would make a great story. I didn't think it you know, in the church as such. But I remember thinking later, and I was busily getting drunk with friends later on in the day, and said, I think there's a story in that. So I asked her, I said, you know, what do you think of that? And she said, well, I'd be delighted, and Stephen would have been delighted, because he'd have loved anything to come out of it, you know. So I wrote the story, but very quickly as I was writing the story, it stopped being about me and my friend. It became a fictional character and his friend, because if I want to write about myself, I'll write about myself. It's just... it's about, you know, and this is the reality, you know, if you reach my age, you do lose friends. And there are other stories about other funerals because, you know, I left Dublin on Tuesday afternoon and I arrived in Auckland in New Zealand on Thursday. And when I put my phone back on, there were 2 texts from my wife that the mothers of 2 friends of ours died. I like to think that it wasn't me in the air that brought on the death, you know, that she urged me to go home by boat so that no more friends, mothers die on my way home. But we're at that stage in our lives now where she calculated we'd been to 9 funerals this year so far, and we haven't been to a wedding in years. And that's got its funny side as well, you know. So it's just I'm using the material that hits me as I get older, as my kids get older. You know, that feeling of... I think any parent with young children, your life is packed. There's routines, there's driving them all around the place. And when it stops, certainly in my experience, I remember at the time thinking when I was standing at the side of a football pitch in the pissing rain, watching my kids play badly, and disappearing into the mud, you know, I think, geez, I wish I wasn't here. But when it stopped, I missed it terribly. And then that goes into the story. So I was just using the material, really, of growing older, I suppose. That's as much. I wrote 1 or 2 stories a year. I didn't set out to write a story about middle-aged, at least a collection about middle-aged men. It just turned out that way. I think I'd written about 9 of them.
How, you know, any one of the characters in there could have carried... It feels like they could carry a novel. So how did it evolve to be a short story collection rather than one of those characters taking off and it becoming a novel?
Nick Hornby, who's a friend of mine, was putting together a collection of stories, and he asked me to write one, and I said I would. I had no idea what I was going to write about, and I can pin it down to almost an exact date, because the millennium, you know, the New Year's Eve, 1999, we went away with friends to West Cork, which is a good distance from our home. And we came back, I think, on the 2nd of January. And I didn't know what I was going to write for Nick, and I had about a month to write the thing. But I always wake up very early in the morning. I wake at about 6 in the morning, and I went into the kitchen. And you know the dimensions of your own house so well. You don't need to turn on the lights. But I was making the coffee for myself and going to sit and read a book. And I dropped the spoon and bent down to pick it up, and there was a dead rat right at my feet. I'd have preferred a live one, you know, but it was dead, and it was rock solid. And so I went through the motion. Well, I got rid of the thing. You know, again, it's a bit like George cleaning up the mess before the kids got up. Got rid of Exhibit A. And it kind of, you know, then got in the pest control people, and they explained that they went, scoured the house, and there was only the one rat. And it wasn't the first rat I've ever seen. It's not even the first rat I was ever close to. It's the first rat in my house I'd ever seen. And mice are a different thing altogether. They're almost welcome when you have a rat. But it became the story. And I changed it because I thought, well, that gets me going. So I imagined the man doing exactly what I had done, going through the same process that I had done. But I gave him an older teenage daughter, which I didn't have. I didn't have teenage children at that point at all. They were still young, but I had friends who had teenage children, and they would occupy quite a lot of our conversations. So I gave him a teenage daughter, and her growing up, and his feeling of vulnerability, or worrying about her as she comes, she goes out at night, and staying up and trying not to let her know that he's wide awake when she gets in every evening. And it became a different kind of story. But the event was what sparked it off, you know, and that's what's happened with these stories. Events sparked them off, really. I fell on the stairs last year and fractured one of my ribs. And almost, as I was going down the stairs, almost immediately I was taking notes. Once I knew my spine was all right, almost immediately, even as I was, you know, I didn't know how much damage I'd done. And luckily my wife, being the person she had done a first aid course, and she was able to tell me, I was almost disappointed that it wasn't too bad. But I had this fractured rib, and I remember I started taking notes then. I was lying in bed.
It's a bit like method acting, isn't it? It's sort of just throwing yourself into the role.
Yeah. See, I've got these varifocals, which are great glasses, but there's a kind of a blind spot. So I walked off the stairs, and it could have been worse, I suppose. But, you know, and it's in a way, at the time, it was, you know, bloody painful, and then the drugs were fantastic. I had 10 days of drugs and going back to bed because I couldn't sleep properly at night, and actually really enjoyed the experience, except for the pain. But, the compensation was I had another story. I haven't actually started it yet. I thought I'd let it fester for a while. And I've actually changed the whole thing completely because of another thing that happened, and I'm blending the two experiences. And very quickly it'll become irrelevant. It will not be a story about me.
Now, I'm going to move on to the Dead Republican, to the trilogy, in terms of the comparison of the research that you put into those books compared to that more spontaneous writing. But I just want to ask something about bullfighting. I think it was on page 6 in the first story. The character talks about how his mother worked at Cadbury's. And in Paddy Clarke, ha ha ha, I think about page 34, there's the boys talking about whose parents work at Cadbury's. And I just wondered if there was any character link or between them.
It's a geographical link.
Geographic. I was going to say, or did you love Cadbury's when you were growing up?
Not particularly.
No.
Any old chocolate, the cheaper and the tackier, the better, really, kids. No, the Cadbury's factory was up the road, and quite a lot of people I knew had mothers, particularly mothers, working in Cadbury's. And I really envied them because at Easter, or the run-up to Easter, I'd have a sandwich for lunch and they'd have an egg that had been somewhat distorted, so it wasn't allowed to go on sale, so the mothers were allowed to bring them home. And I thought that was brilliant, that they had an Easter egg for their lunch, and I had something healthy, what no kid wants. And but yeah, it's about a mile from the factory's about a mile from where I grew up.
Yeah.
And it's about a mile, maybe a mile and a half, where I spent the first decade or so of my married life. So it's kind of everybody from my part of Dublin knows Cadbury's factory,
Now, with the Henry Smart trilogy, I imagine this took a lot of research.
Yeah.
How much of your life have you dedicated to this trilogy, and when did you start off with that?
I finished The Woman Who Walked Into Doors, which I think was my 5th book, in 1995 sometime, and I started Henry immediately then, and that would have been 1995, and I finished the 3rd part, The Dead Republic, in 2009.
Do you want to just tell, in case people haven't read it, just a little bit of background about the character?
I haven't thought about him in a long time. I thought once the 3rd book was finished, I just was happy to see the bastard go, But Henry Smart is born in 1900, and he lives most of his life on the streets of Dublin. In Dublin, before independence, and for quite a while after independence, was, I suppose, one of the poorest cities of Europe. Considering it was the 2nd city of the empire, it was an absolute disgrace. And the mortality rate was higher than, say, Moscow before the revolution. And the housing conditions were absolutely atrocious. Now, they were for a lot of working people in every city in the world. But I suppose my imagination was fired by family history, by the plays of Sean O'Casey, who I loved, and a lot of good, significant novels that were written by Irish writers. But so anyway, Henry at a very young age becomes involved in the Republican movement and claims to have been either actively involved in virtually every scrape and battle of the War of Independence or to have been on the periphery. But at the end of the 1st book, A Star Called Henry, he's still a very young man. He has to get out of Ireland because he's antagonised both sides in the Civil War, both the Republican side and the Free State side, as it's called, and he leaves. And eventually, in the 2nd book, he finds himself, or he ends up in America. And the 2nd book is about his time in America. And he meets Louis Armstrong. And that came from, I read a biography of Louis Armstrong, and a fascinating man, brilliant, brilliant man. And when he grew up in New Orleans, and he was leaving to go to Chicago to become the man we know of as, Satchmo and Louis Armstrong. And a club bouncer, gave him a piece of advice. He said, I'm going to use a word that most people find offensive these days, and rightly so. But he said to him, Louis, when you get up there, get yourself a white man who can put his hand on your shoulder and say, this here is my nigger. The advice was you'd need a white man to get in the door of any say, studio or anything at all. That if you didn't have a white man looking after you, you weren't going to succeed. So I thought at first, well, maybe I'll make that white man Henry. Because there's a parallel in their ages, and they were both very much self-invented men. But then I turned it slightly, because when Louis Armstrong explains to Henry that this is what he was told, and Henry said, so I'm that white man. And Louis says, no, you're the white guy who puts his hand on the white guy's shoulder and says, no, he's my nigger. So that Henry was there to look after Louis, you know. But I just thought there was meat there for a story. And he ends up then meeting John Ford, the film director, and this was his excuse to come back to Ireland to make The Quiet Man. And I won't go into the detail there because it will take forever. But he arrives back in Ireland then in the early 1950s and stays then for the rest of the book. And in the meanwhile, the myth of Henry Smart, the Republican hero, has grown and grown and grown. And the modern IRA, the Sinn Féin, the Republican movement, use their heroes. And he's one of the last standing living heroes. So they use him. So he's around before what became known, those of you with the knowledge of Irish current affairs, it would be the peace process, you know, and I grew up with the Troubles, as they were called, that sort of daily tit for tat and the news headlines that people stopped listening to about, you know, somebody, a Catholic being shot, a Protestant being shot, a bomb going off, and is, you know, a daily occurrence. And Henry is involved, sometimes unknowingly, but he becomes aware of it, in the secret negotiations that went on, that eventually became public and eventually became the cessation of violence. And he's around during the hunger strikes in 1981, and so he's involved, if you like, in Irish history, really. Or what I hope the book would be, in a way, an exploration of the definition of Irishness. Because it's easy, you know, if I say I'm Irish, it actually means very little, very, very little, and quite rightly so. It's who controls the definition of what it is to be Irish. I think that's what a lot of politics is about at the end. Who controls the image, who controls the definition. And it's fascinating in a way because at the moment that's exactly what's going on in Ireland as well. But, you know, it's all about now portraying ourselves to the outside world because we've been seen as the success story of Europe and now we're a walking disaster, you know, and we have to, you know, writers like myself are being pushed forward as being the real Ireland, not the bankers, you know. And I find it a bit, I'm here, but I'm not representing my country. I'm hoping a few people will buy me a book. You know? But so it's really interesting as to hold, and the centenary of 1916, of course, is coming up. And of course, you would have thought, well, it's just 100 years, big deal. But it actually is going to be hugely important because it really is up for grabs as to what the country's priorities are and who we are. And Sinn Féin has become, at the moment, the second biggest political party in Ireland, you know, which is a thought that I'd never thought would occur. Yeah. So we always live in interesting times, I suppose. But the book, in a way, the three books, it's a bit like, you know, you ask somebody to marry you. And none of us would do that, I think, even those of us, and I am happily married, but I don't think any of us would do that if we knew blow by blow what's going to happen. You know, we need that romantic stupidity to go up and say, will you marry me? Because I wouldn't marry myself, that's for sure. But it's the same when you start a book, I think. You know, you just got, I'll write a book. And even though I've written 10 of them now, I've written more because I write for children, it's the same giddy feeling. Yeah. It's like falling in love all over again, and then, you know, a year into the thing, you curse it. But with Henry, it just took a lot longer. Now, I was doing other work at the same time. I wasn't, you know, up in my attic just devoting myself to that. But the research was just, you know, book after book after book after book after book. And Google hadn't been invented when I started, you know, and just as well, because, you know, you can't... Wikipedia says, apparently, they at least up until recently, in the biography, I had nothing to do with the page about me, but it said I lived in Monte Carlo. Yeah. I'd never been to Monte Carlo. I believe Shirley Bassey lives in Monte Carlo, and Ringo Starr, so they'd be my neighbours if I lived there, but which would be interesting.
Now, can I take you right back to probably the beginning of your literary career, back to the Commitments, which... Now, when was that published?
1987.
87. You've said in a previous interview that the Commitments made you as much as you made the novel, and I just wondered what you meant by that. Had there been...
I don't know.
What was your journey up to that point? Were you very determined to be a writer from a young age? Had you been doing a lot of writing?
I think I must have been determined. That surprises me, because I don't see myself like that. But I must have been determined. I published the book myself in Dublin because nobody else was interested in anything I was doing. And in retrospect, probably quite rightly, I did write another novel. I started getting into the habit of writing, which is really important. The discipline, the habit of it is probably as important as the art. Because if the art can be up in the air forever, but if you don't sit and actually write it, and more importantly, if you don't look at it and judge it and hammer it, go at it with a red biro, and learn how to separate what's good and what's bad, and don't assume that because... say in my case that because I've written 9 novels that the 10th is grand, I'll just write it and it'll be fine, because you have to be you're only as good as what you're doing today. Mm-hmm. And I think having gone through the rigour of writing what I now know is a very bad novel, when I started writing The Commitment, something clicked, and it is almost like a clicking, one of those little light bulb moments. I started it in January 1986, and I began to feel that this was different. This is exactly what I wanted to write, and it was the people I wanted to write about, the subject, even the way I was telling the story, not getting bogged down in descriptions of people, which never really interested me. Or, you walk into a room, I only describe what's in the room if it serves the purpose. I don't do furniture. And none of them have cars, and that was grand as well, because I've no interest in cars. And it's not just that I corralled the story because of my prejudices or my ignorance, but it was just the way I wanted to tell the story, and it was. I suppose a lot of people looking back on their first books say that it wrote itself, and in a way, it feels like that. Now it's easy for me to say that because it's so long ago, but I wrote it very, very quickly, and I can't figure out how I managed to write it. I was teaching full time, and I wrote in the evenings and during school holidays. I finished it in June of that year, but. I think the writing of The Commitments gave me that. It's as if I was in a wheelchair at the top of a hill, and writing The Commitments gave me the push, and I've been going downhill ever since, in a nice way.
And the thing that distinguishes your writing is the dialogue and your ear for dialect, and you get criticised a lot for the language offensive language that you use. Where does that come from, your kind of ear for the vernacular and picking up on that?
I don't know. I've always liked listening. I never eavesdrop, I never linger in the hope I'll hear something interesting. I never do that. But I always loved listening to people. I always loved the way people express themselves. My mother does as well. She gets great crack out of hearing the way people talk, and my father. And I remember when I was a kid, she mimicked the neighbours really quite brilliantly. None of them are aware of it now. In fact, most of them are dead. It's one of my parents' triumphs is that they're the last standing, or some of the last standing, serial funeral attenders they are as well. They miss, if there isn't a funeral a week, they get quite anxious. But it might be that to a degree. And also, I grew up in an area where everybody moved into it was an estate that was built very quickly in the, well-built houses, extremely well-built houses, in the early 50s, and young married couples moved into these houses. And we had 4 kids. There could have been 5, but one of them died. So there were 4 of us, and we would have been one of the small families. There were, 4 kids. Like there were 7 kids, there were 8 kids, there were 9 kids, and they all just vomited out onto the streets in the 1960s. And Ireland being Ireland, and Dublin particularly being Dublin, not one of them ever shut up, I can only think of one child who never said a word, and she grew up and became a lawyer. I rest my case. I don't know. She was kind of a sinister, evil force, and she never said a word. I'm being very unfair to her, I suppose, but anyway, she's not here. But so it was always, and at the school I went to the national school, even at public school, there were 54 boys in the class. And it's hard to imagine now. 54, the teacher contained and controlled and educated us really, really well, 54 boys. And again, even if you knew the answer to a question and you wanted the teacher to pick you. You know, you were one of 54, so you had to be loud, you know. And then when I became a teacher myself, I really fell in love with the job very quickly. And it wasn't the job itself in a way, although I did and I do think teaching is a fantastic occupation and very important one. But I was meeting quite literally any one day. If I had you know, there were 9 periods during the day, and I'd meet, you know, if I had sometimes I'd have all 9 periods, you know, and you have 30 kids, 35 kids. This was 1979 coming in each time, so you're meeting several hundred different people every day. And it was amazing. It was just amazing. And these were working class kids, you know, and just so full of life, really full of life. And it all comes out in words. There was one young lad, I remember him, and you know, the only way to contain him, because he was a one-man circus, he used to talk a film. And this would, so to basically get his bubbles out of him, so the rest of the 40 minutes could be used reading Jane Austen's. Sorry, just the mere thought of teaching Jane Austen to a bunch of working class boys. she did. I'd like to think, I'm an atheist, but I'd like to think that Jane Austen has an afterlife, and that she could see bunches of kids in Dublin as they read Persuasion. I just said, it's fucking shite, isn't it? Yeah. But anyway, this kid, I'd tell him, you know, and it became part of the routine. Every Friday afternoon, Terence would tell a film. And he got up, I cleared my desk, and he got up on the table, and he had 2 minutes to tell the plot. Suppose it's pitching, except the film had been made already. And actually, he would be a brilliant professional pitcher. And he would fly through the plot of films that I'd never seen, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street. And a hand came up out of the jacks, and, you know, Jack's being the toilet. And he'd bring the whole thing alive, and it was brilliant. And he'd get to the end, and the class would cheer, and that was the end of that. And it was part of my job. I was being paid to do this. But I think it was listening to him all the time. And I think then when I started to sit down and write, it was just there. You know, It was just there. It's a lot of work. I mean, you know, the trick is, I suppose, to make it look effortless. But there is a lot of work involved. But I read a lot of other writers' work, you know, and I'm involved in a writing centre for young people, and there's a lot of adults involved as well. So I read a lot of people's manuscripts, and it always puzzles me that dialogue is a problem for them. I don't get it at all, because I just don't get that. I don't know why they can't imagine a conversation between 2 people. I just can't figure it out, really.
I understand reading your books. Now, we're going to open up to questions from the audience, but there was one thing I just wanted to read to you about dealing with literary criticism.
Oops.
Where is it? You're asked by the Guardian back in 2010, what's the worst review you've ever had and why? And you said, an Irish Times review of a reading I gave of one of my children's books, Rover Saves Christmas in Dublin. The reviewer referred to the stench of celebrity vanity. I've seen him many times since. I've even said hello to him, but I will eventually kill him. I'm just wondering if he's still alive.
He is alive, and I know where he lives. And when I get the bad news that I have terminal cancer or something like that, I will say, good, thanks very much. And on my way home to break the news to my family, I will visit him first. No, I'm joking. I've got over it. But it was a particularly cruel review. It was a lovely show. It was a staged reading in a children's theatre, you know, and we had music, and I read the story, and everybody enjoyed themselves. And the fucker, pardon my language, but he is one. At the end of the review, he conceded that his children enjoyed it. But he called it their stench of celebrity vanity. And I'm getting angry now.
Oh. No.
I think I know a guy in Dublin who knows a guy who knows a guy who will get rid of him. So I might, that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to hire a hitman.
Yeah. And you're going to stop reading reviews.
I should. Yeah,
but you
I
keep
should.
Doing
but
it.
Occasionally they're good, and you get a little childish pleasure out of that as well. You know.
Very good. Now, if we open it to questions from the audience.
That's a relief. There is an audience.
Hello. I would just like to know in Bullfighting, what was the spark that led to the story? I can't remember the name, but the man who drank the blood.
Blood.
Oh, yeah.
What led to that?
There are two things that happened. The writer Neil Gaiman, whose work I like a lot, he writes a lot of, I suppose, Gothic work. He wrote this wonderful book called The Graveyard Book, which was published maybe 2 years ago. And it was my favourite of his books, but it's one of I love reading his work. And he contacted me, and he was putting together an anthology of stories. He wanted people to cross from the stuff they usually wrote and maybe have a stab at writing something else. And by coincidence, some years ago, we moved house, not far away from where we'd lived originally. We moved house about a mile closer to Dublin city centre, to a place called Clontarf, on the north side of Dublin. But I live very close to the house that Bram Stoker grew up in and lived a lot of his life. The author of Dracula, as you know. And for some reason, I liked that fact. And I like the fact that I walk by his house on a regular basis, and that my children walk by his house on a regular basis and cycle past his house. I love the association, and I live in a city full of plaques. You know, there are plaques to writers all over the place, and they mean nothing to me whatsoever. I mean, if you knocked down all the houses that James Joyce lived in, I think my house would be the only remaining one in the city. So it means nothing to me. But for some reason, because I like Dracula, I love Dracula and all the stuff that has come out of that, and all the films, and, you know, the good stuff and the bad stuff, and even watching Twilight with my daughter. So I like reading about zombies and vampires and things, like that. So when he asked me to do this story, I thought, well, I'll have a stab at this somehow or other. And without giving the plot away, I write children's books, and one of the reasons I do that is because it allows me to get a little bit of madness into the stories that the realistic story, adult work, doesn't allow. So I decided to put a little bit of madness into the story. It's called Blood. And also it coincides again with the recession. And one of the things about the recession in Ireland, one of the immediate responses to it from middle-class people was that they bought chickens and put them in their backyards, as if a chicken a day was some sort of a measured response to the tightened times that we were living in, That a chicken, an egg, that it was a virtuous thing to have your own egg rather than go to a shop and spend money on an egg. So, at first it was on the south side of Dublin, and loads of people we knew were buying these chickens. I thought it was pathetic, really, And what's great about it as well is Dublin, you don't have foxes in this country, do you?
Yes.
You do? Yeah, well, Dublin is awash with the things. But in my side of Dublin, if I walk to my local pub, if I don't see a fox, it's an unusual walk. You say it at 10 at night. And the urban foxes are they outnumber the dogs somehow. So the chickens didn't really get a look in the long term. And of course, the great thing about foxes now is, after the fantastic Mr. Fox, they're all George Clooney, which is really, it's really cool that George, you see, when you look out your window and you see George Clooney trotting across the back garden. So all these things came together at the same time, in a way. And I wanted to have a bit of fun, this notion that a man in his middle years, this midlife crisis thing, that actually it becomes somehow, he's metamorphosizing into something else. But I decided, at first I wasn't going to put it in that collection of stories, but then I decided if I put it in the middle, it's like the halftime entertainment. So I hope I've answered your question. But just to reassure you, I didn't feel a burning need to do any of the things that he did. I've great faith in my imagination.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, just was going to ask about other Dublin-based writers who are kind of up-and-coming, younger writers.
Yeah.
And just some names, because I'm not sure.
So, the opposition, you mean? No, I think there are great. People might be familiar with the names, but there's Claire Keegan, is one of the best short story writers writing today. Kevin Barry, a familiar name. If you Google Kevin Barry, you're going to find all sorts of Republican heroes. But the writer, Kevin Barry, has 2 collections of stories in a novel, and it's a joy. It's just, and if he ever comes to town, he's a fantastic reader of his own work. But his work is absolutely brilliant. Paul Murray, a novel called Skippy Dies, which I think is brilliant. Not your Skippy, rest easy. A different Skippy entirely. And they're names that spring to mind. They're all younger than me. Claire Kilroy, not to be confused with Claire Keegan, is another terrific writer. To be honest, they're the usual names as well, but they perhaps are names of people who aren't as well known as they will be, perhaps, or should be. And I'm trying to think, are there any? I'm sure there are plenty, and at 5 in the morning I'll wake up and I'll think, oh, I should have mentioned, and I should have mentioned. But they're the ones who spring to mind at the moment.
Do we have time for more questions? Yeah? Anyone else? Yes, up at the back, the red top.
Thank you for reading your story. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
I would like to just ask you, what is an Irish writer?
What is an Irish writer? Yeah. Oh. Well, it can be one of 2 things, I suppose. It can be a writer who was born in Ireland and writes, or it can be somebody living in Ireland who writes. So I don't think it's necessary to be born in Ireland or to live in Ireland to be an Irish writer. And I wouldn't burden an Irish writer with any other adjectives or anything like that. So I don't think there's any such thing as a writer who's less or more Irish. So there are, I know now, writers who were originally born in Poland or Nigeria, living in Ireland and writing about Ireland, and they're Irish writers as far as I'm concerned. And then there are other Irish writers who, perhaps in Australia as well, who haven't lived in Ireland in a long, long time. And they're writing about Australia, but if they want to call themselves Irish, that's grand as well. Particularly if they start winning prizes and stuff like that. Any party go and we'll claim any. We're desperately in need of triumph these days, so we'll take it. But I'm always wary. I'm aware that when I leave my own country, I suddenly become Irish. And I know I'm never aware that I have an Irish accent until I'm surrounded by other accents and I know of an Irish accent. And when I get home then, I put my Irishness beside my coat and I just become a writer and all the other things I do with my life. But I don't choose the topics I write about because I'm an Irish writer. I think Dublin is more significant to me than my country. And if a Dublin passport existed, I'd want one of them, really. I'll get in trouble now for having said that. But so that's what an Irish writer is, as far as I'm concerned.
Anyone else? Yes?
Hi, Roddy. Just wondering, how much does politics influence or motivate your writing? Obviously, you mentioned the recession a lot of times tonight, and also a lot of your social commentaries. How much is it politically motivated?
Well, I suppose it's inevitable. I don't know if it's motivated by politics, but if I'm writing about a character, as I am at the moment, who's living in Dublin today, in 2012, part of his life is fashioned by political decisions. So, yeah, to a degree, I am interested in politics, but I've become less interested in party politics, that confrontational pretense, 2 sides shouting at each other. Because in fact, really, there's little to distinguish them in the end. And it's easy for opposition to be in opposition, but then when they get into government, as happened in Ireland last year, they become the government immediately, and they become even more pompous than the previous crowd suddenly. Give them 3 wet weeks and they're suddenly, as big a gang of bastards as the previous crowd, slightly less corrupt, which is an advance. Well, I wouldn't use the football analogy here now. But so I am interested in politics, yeah. But only the result of politics. You know, men playing golf together has dictated has put an awful stamp on the lives of a lot of people in Dublin now, you know, and that's interesting. I'm not interested in writing about the men who play golf. I've never played golf in my life, and I'm not saying that proudly. I just don't have any interest in golf. And I never want to wear a lemon sweater. And I believe you have to if you play golf. You know, I've seen pictures of well-dressed golfers, and it doesn't work for me. But I'm interested in the people who have to endure these decisions. But I live in quite a middle-class area now as well, and I'm interested in the middle class as well as the working class. And I think there's a grey zone between them as well. And in Ireland, that grey zone is where most people live. But the character I'm writing about at the moment, he's being to an extent hemmed in by the consequences of the lost decade. And it's about him and other people and how they cope with that. And I wrote a book about unemployed men 20-something years ago, The Van. And it's important that I don't slip into just trying to repeat that, because, of course, it's different. Each recession is different. This is a deeper one, not just economically, but in Ireland, we all grew up in relative poverty, so that we thought it was normal life. We didn't know it was a recession. It's only years later we were told it was a recession. And then when we came out of that, there's people in their 20s and 30s didn't know that. So they've fallen into a much deeper hole than we ever climbed out of, if that makes sense. So in the new book, for example, the next door neighbours suddenly aren't there. They're gone. In a way that you perhaps would associate with the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, America. They're just gone. One day they're there, the next minute the house is empty. And it's a disturbing emptiness as far as they're concerned. Particularly my character's wife finds it very, very upsetting. And when they are sitting up in bed reading, they're leaning against the wall and there's an empty house behind them. And I don't think any of us want to live beside an empty house, particularly emptied in those circumstances. So I'm looking around for new ways of telling a story that's been repeated since man started, I suppose. Have I answered your question? Well, it'll have to do.
And when should we expect that book?
When it's finished. It's the end is in sight, but these are very good glasses, if you know what I mean.
Well, we've come to the end of our session. If you could join me in thanking Roddy very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.